When we talk about the descending 6-5 progression, to be honest with you, this chart that I've always been showing you doesn't help us much. Let me show you what the descending 6-5 progression looks like. We start with the 1 and we go to a 5 chord, but very important is that you go to a first inversion 5 chord. Now I need for you to, I'll visualize this for you when we move to music notation, but I want you to sort of in your mind visualize right now. The interval between the lowest note and the highest note in a 1 chord, in a triad, is a 5th. And the interval between the lowest note and the highest note in a first inversion chord is a 6th, right? So in this case, if we're in C major, and we have a 5 chord in first inversion, imagine it, you've got a B in the bass, and then you go through the other chord tones, you get a D, and then you get a G above that. So the interval between the B and the G is a 6th. And this is where the name comes from. We start with a 5th, and then we go to a 6th, and then we're going to keep going down to a 5th. We get the 6th chord. And if we notice here, we've got 1 to 5, and so it's up a 5th. So from the 6th up a 5th would be the 3 chord, and we get 3, we get that 3 in first inversion. And notice this, 1 to 6 is down by a third. So I'm going to guess that the next one, if we have some kind of pattern here, which we do, is going to be the 4 chord. And that's, of course, what we get. And the 5th above the 4 chord is the 1 chord. We put that in first inversion. And then you see I have this little arrow here saying keep going. You can keep doing this. What we're going to do in music notation in a second is actually go through this pattern. And when we get to 4, we're going to create a cadence of 4, 5, and then 1. But I wanted to explain here, now if you go to this chart, okay, we go to 5, and you're not supposed to be able to get to the 6. And from the 6, you're not supposed to get to the 3. From the 3, you can get to the 4. So this chart actually isn't going to help us very much with this progression. So this is just one of those progressions you'd want to memorize. But it's fairly easy to memorize because you can really look at it as a 1, 6, 4, 2, and then you can keep going 7, 5, keep going down by thirds. And that you do get in this chart, right? You get 1, if you go to 6, you can go to 4, which you can substitute with 2. You can go to 7, you can substitute with 5, and 5 brings you back to 1. And in between each of those root position chords, you put in, as a kind of transitional chord, you put in the 5th above that chord in first inversion. And you'll see actually that it creates a very nice smooth bass line. So enough of that. It seems very abstract to present it this way. Let's really show it in music notation. So let's try to now visualize what this progression looks like. I'm going to do something I haven't done before, which is work with only 3 voices. So we're not worried so much about doubling of things. And I just want to really show how this all works. What makes a lot of sense in such a progression is that you keep the common tone, and I'll show you this, why that's the case, when I go from this 1 chord to this 5 chord, right? Because we want to go 1 and then 5 in first inversion, right? So 5 in first inversion, that means I need a B here. I'm going to need a G and a D up here. Well, we've got the common tone there. Keep that. And move this by step. Okay, now let's just double check that we haven't done anything sinful, right? So we've got the C and we've got the E. They're a third apart and they move in parallel motion. So that's no problem. The common tone stays, so there's no problem there in terms of voice leading. So let's notice though, between the bass note and this first note here, let's call this the alto. The bass and the alto, you see, it's a 12th. When we reduce that, when we take the octave out in between, we get a 5th. And then if we see that that stays the same, and this moves down by a step, well, if that was a 5th, that means this has to be a 6th, yeah? So here's the sort of the basis of this 5-6, descending 5-6 progression. This is another one that this next step I'll actually write out, but this is another one. After this bar, I'll just use cut and paste. It's another progression again where you can just use cut and paste. So now we want the 6th chord. There's our 6th chord, and we need to move our other voices smoothly. Well, we've got no common tones here, so let's move them. Now, ideally, you'd move in contrary motion, but that's not going to make a ton of sense, because if we were to move in contrary motion with 3 voices, that would mean that this has to jump all the way up to the C, and this has to go to the E. Because if this just went up to let me do it right now, I'll show you. Right there. There are 2 problems. First of all, parallel fifths. And second of all, we get root, root, and fifth. We get no third. So that really doesn't work out for us. So we're going to have to move, we're going to have to sacrifice contrary motion here and have this G go down to the E and this D go to the C, so that we get root, third, and fifth. Again, we just voice lead this smoothly. The next thing we need to go to is 3 in first inversion. So we put the G in the bass. The 3 chord is an E minor chord. So here's our common tone. It's an E. Keep that E. And we need to move the other by step, and we need to complete the triad. So we've got third and root. We need the fifth, which is right there. And so let's look at this. Well, a couple of things before we continue. You notice how I just said when I was talking about the voice leading of this progression, that we get a very nice smooth bass line. And that's exactly what happens. Look how smooth this bass line is. It looks actually, when you look at the chords, that there's a lot of jumping around, a lot of movement from 1 to 5. But when you put those chords, those 5 chords that are a fifth apart in first inversion, then you get this bass line. And when the other progression going on, which is descending by thirds, 1 to 6 to 4, when that's when you insert the chord that's a fifth above in first inversion, between them, you get this very smooth bass line. Okay, so let me just, we can also see this is basically a third above this. It's the same exact thing. So this is a third below that. Let's say that. So we should basically be able to do this. We should be able to cut and paste, repeat this whole thing, and then just shift it down to get the next part. And that's in fact what we can do. This is the 4 chord, right? F. It's a 4 chord in C major. And we get root, third, and fifth. And then the 1 in first inversion, root, third, and fifth. Good voice leading, and this is fine. Let me play it this far. I'm actually going to remove this chord in a second, but I want you to hear the progression with that chord in there. Okay, so I think many of you say, oh, wow, that's like Pachelbel's canon, yeah? Yes, indeed, it is. That's the progression at the root of that composition. And in fact, we can actually, no, I won't remove this chord. I'll just finish Pachelbel's canon. What happens in that piece? Well, we go back to 4, 5, and 1, so that we get a kind of cadence, cadence there. Whoops. 4, 5, and 1. And now let's voice lead this. Well, we didn't have any problem going from the 4 chord to the 1 in first inversion. So there shouldn't be any problem going from the 1 in first inversion back to the 4 chord. We get that. Then we need to voice lead. We have 4 to 5, so we've got to be careful, right? Because this is the progression where we can get very easily all sorts of parallel fifths and octaves. And in fact, one would be tempted to do this, right? It's very nice. We get root, third, fifth, and it's all voice led very smoothly. Everything's by step, and of course you see immediately that you've got parallel fifths. So you can't do this. So you use the contrary motion approach. Bass goes up by step, the others go down by smallest interval possible. And in this case, that smallest interval is a step. Now you may say, oh, wait a second, you have a root and a third. So to review, one might ask, wait, is that allowed? Yes, it's allowed. In this case, it makes so much more sense to have a root and a third than to do this, something like that, to get the fifth. This melodically is very strange. It would be equally strange to do this. So if we have that, we can't always have what we want, right? We all know this in life. And we can't always have what we want in voice leading either. So would it be ideal if we could have a fifth, the fifth of the chord sound as well? Yeah, ideally it would be. But in a three-voice texture, that's not always the case. And it makes much more sense to keep the melodic line sort of consistent and smooth than to have it leap just for the purpose of giving us a fifth. And then we voice lead again. We're going to get a similar kind of situation here where the leading tone resolves up. And this guy, well, we have root and root. So if we kept this like that, we get root, root, fifth, which is no good. We need the third at least. It makes much more sense to go to this third. Someone might say, well, hey, why don't you, this is an inner voice, why don't you jump up to the third? And you could. So, for instance, you could do this. I don't think that's as nice. If this was something that really needed to happen, then it would be okay to do. But I think it's a bit nicer if we resolve this leading tone to the tonic. Remember, it is three voices, so there's a bit more exposure here, even with an inner voice, than when we have four voices. The inner voices with four voices get covered up pretty quickly, or pretty well. With three voices, it's less so. So that would be my reasoning for wanting to move the leading tone to the tonic. It's also from my perspective, it's nicer to end this line with the third rather than the fifth as the melody note. Let me play it with the fifth as a melody note, and then play it with the third. You can disagree with me, please. You're more than welcome to disagree with me. If you think the fifth sounds great as the melody note, then again, there's nothing wrong with this. I just feel that the third sounds a bit nicer, but let's listen to them and compare. So there you have it, the descending 5-6 progression, which is our second of three sequential progressions that we'll look at. Next up is the parallel sixth progression.